Welcome to the debate. Our focus today is on the massive, and I think often opaque, architecture that governs nearly every economic decision in modern life: consumer financial scoring. We're talking about the rapid evolution of FICO and VantageScore, their shift into alternative data, their incorporation of trended history, and their expansion into non-financial applications like housing and insurance.
The scope is certainly widened dramatically. The central tension we really have to grapple with here is this. Does this technological evolution, this embrace of complex new models and data sources, does it truly represent a beneficial path towards, say, greater financial inclusion and accuracy? Or is it fundamentally functioning as a powerful, complex engine that just magnifies social and economic inequality?
I'm going to argue for the former. I believe that the current trajectory of these scoring models is fundamentally beneficial. It is leading to superior predictive accuracy, which in turn leads to greater accessibility, particularly for the tens of millions of consumers who have historically been, underserved by older snapshot models.
And I guess I have to take the opposing view here. I'll argue that the increasing complexity and the widening scope of these scoring systems, they inevitably reinforce and amplify these deep-seated existing systemic disparities. They often function as a kind of high-tech bottleneck that disproportionately penalizes the financially fragile, all while, claiming to promote inclusion.
Okay, so let's start with the evidence for modernization and inclusion, right? The shift to newer models like VantageScore 4.0 and FICO 10T is driven purely by, superior predictive performance. VantageScore 4.0 specifically enables the accurate assessment of approximately 33 million more consumers than the older benchmark models. Now, that is a significant number of people moving from credit invisibility into the mainstream economy, gaining access to capital they were previously denied.
That is certainly a powerful number for the volume of assessments, but I find that this whole push for inclusion comes tethered to a mechanism of pretty profound exclusion, what I'd call the credit tax. We just can't deny that the scores themselves perpetuate economic exclusion by acting as an amplifier of pre-existing systemic inequities.
But modernization is also being driven by regulatory action that's aimed at reducing barriers. We see the FHFA approving both FICO 10T and VantageScore 4.0 for use in mortgages. And crucially, Fannie Mae is removing its historical hard minimum credit score requirement of 620, effective this November 2025. This removes a huge historical barrier, replacing it with an automated risk assessment tool that considers the overall financial profile, not just a single minimum threshold.
That may sound like progress, I get that. But the economic reality reveals this credit tax that actively throttles wealth building for anyone at the lower score tiers. Let's just quantify the impact in the mortgage market for a second. If you compare a super prime borrower, someone scoring, say, 760 to 850, to a fair borrower in the 620 to 639 range, on a typical 30-year mortgage, you're looking at a difference of over $59,000 in total interest paid over the life of the loan.
Well, sure. But that difference in the interest rate, that is the mechanism of risk pricing. Capital costs more for higher risk, and that's what protects the solvency of the entire lending system.
See, that's where I have to push back on that characterization of risk pricing. That extra $59,000 paid in interest, month after month, is money not going into a 401k match, or a college savings plan, or diversifying investments. It actively prevents the fair borrower from building generational wealth and achieving financial mobility. And while credit scores are legally forbidden from considering things like race or income, the source material confirms that the inputs to the score are intrinsically tied to these historic differences in wealth-building opportunities. It makes the system a high-tech reinforcer of inequality. And as for Fannie Mae, removing a hard floor of 620 is kind of meaningless if the new, opaque, automated tool simply calculates a 620 equivalent through a more complex, less transparent model. The exclusion is just harder to audit.
Okay, let's pivot and address the complexity issue, which you cite as a source of consumer harm. The proliferation of models, FICO 8, 9, 10T, VantageScore 3.0, 4.0, it's about better risk stratification. It's not about consumer deception.
I'm just not convinced that line of reasoning holds up because the sheer number of models and their inherent variability, that leads directly to significant consumer harm and just widespread confusion.
I don't think that's quite the right way to look at it. The goal is specialized, reliable prediction. And studies show that both newer models like VS 4.0 and classic FICO are highly effective. Furthermore, one notable study found that for single borrowers, VantageScore 4.0 scores are consistently, on average, 14 to 16 points higher than classic FICO. Now, that small variance often helps a responsible borrower cross an eligibility threshold for better rates. It aids inclusion rather than hindering it.
But this variation creates a massive gulf for the consumer. A sizable minority, we're talking between 11 and 16% of consumers, according to one analysis, have scores that differ by 2 or more deciles across scoring models. This massive divergence means consumers checking their free educational score, which is often a VantageScore, might significantly overestimate their creditworthiness. So they go and apply for a loan, which triggers a hard inquiry, which instantly docks their score a few points, and then they're denied because the lender pulled an older, more conservative FICO version, maybe a FICO 2 or 5, which are still used for mortgages. So now they have a damaged score and no loan. The complexity overwhelmingly favors the sophisticated lender who knows exactly which proprietary key to use over the average consumer who's just relying on their free score.
That points to a need for better consumer education, yes. But it also points to the fact that the innovation in data inclusion is where we see real progress against that kind of historical inertia. Let's look at FICO 10T, which is replacing the older Snapshot method. This model is powerful because it uses trended data. It analyzes 30 months of past account performance, specifically how a borrower manages their debt over time. It rewards consistent positive habits, recognizing that a recent spike in utilization is less risky than a sustained period of high debt. This fundamentally makes the system more equitable because it recognizes long-term responsibility rather than punishing a temporary snapshot.
You're right that the idea of using trended data to capture long-term habits is an improvement on the predictive side. But the expansion of data sources itself introduces new exclusionary potential, particularly with alternative data. The push for inclusion using positive rental history, for instance, which is now being mandated for some landlords in California by AB 2747. That sounds positive on the surface.
It is positive. I mean, strategies like Experian Boost and Ultra FICO, which use positive bank account data like balances and history, or the increasing use of rent reporting services enabled by this legislation, they add positive payment information to thin files. This is crucial for younger generations who demonstrate financial responsibility but just lack long credit histories. This is the definition of inclusion.
I guess I would frame it differently. While rent reporting sounds inclusive, its implementation really suggests a new layer of risk stratification. We're seeing the rise of specialized scores like the residence score, which operates in that same 350 to 850 range, but it specifically prioritizes rental-related behavior, like past evictions or late rent. This creates a targeted exclusion mechanism specifically for housing that a traditional financial score might not show. A divergence here, let's say a high financial credit score but a low residence score, means you are effectively a good debt manager who is nevertheless an undesirable tenant. Expanding data collection beyond just debt management into housing and lifestyle indicators is arguably a step toward broader social management, not inclusion.
But assessing rental history is critical risk management for landlords. That score simply provides predictive accuracy tailored to the specific risk, rental risk. That is tailored inclusion, not exclusion, for the millions of renters who are now getting positive recognition from making timely payments.
That migration of scoring into housing, employment screening, and insurance, though, it brings us directly to the most critical contention. The expansion of these data systems risks crossing the line from financial risk assessment into a de facto social scoring system. The functional expansion of data use pushes us closer to a surveillance model, and it carries criticisms very similar to those leveled against China's social credit system.
Okay, I have to say, I think that analogy it's fundamentally misleading and maybe dangerously alarmist. It is vital that we maintain the distinction between assessing actuarial financial risk, the ability to repay a debt,
and enforcing moral or political behavior. The U.S. system is explicitly regulated.
But the function is what matters. The available data on non-financial social credit systems should serve as a warning. Experimental studies on SCS show that the mere public assignment of high or low tiers led to a significant negative impact on interpersonal cooperation and trust. Now look at our domestic system. Your score dictates whether you can get affordable car insurance, whether you need to pay a substantial utility deposit, or whether you get past the initial HR screen for a job. When credit scores govern access to non-financial necessities like employment, utilities, and housing, they function very similarly to an SCS in limiting participation in modern society. They perpetuate pre-existing social disparities using these heuristic cues derived from financial history.
But the U.S. system is governed by the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, which explicitly forbids the use of demographic factors like race, religion, sex, or national origin in the lending decision. The factors used are narrowly defined: payment history at 35%, amounts owed at 30%, length of credit history at 15%. The focus is narrowly on debt repayment probability. Furthermore, consumer protections are constantly expanding, not shrinking.
You're pointing to the intent of the law, but I'm pointing to the outcome.
And I'm pointing to the active regulatory pushback that proves the system is dynamic and responsive. The National Consumer Assistance Plan removed civil judgments and tax liens from reports, drastically cleaning up many reports that had unfair blemishes. And beyond that, the ongoing attempts by the CFPB to bar the inclusion of medical debt, a battle that's still being waged, shows active regulatory scrutiny against overly intrusive or unfair data use. We have to focus on improving the accuracy of this necessary risk assessment, not discarding the crucial cost of capital filter based on these speculative fears of social control. The infrastructure is fundamentally about financial solvency.
But solvency at what cost to equity and social mobility? That's really the question.
So, to summarize my position, the evolving credit architecture is, I think, demonstrably moving toward greater accuracy. The approval of powerful new models like FICO 10T and VantageScore 4.0, combined with the successful integration of alternative data, is creating verifiable pathways to financial inclusion for previously underserved consumers who simply lacked a traditional credit file. Accuracy and inclusion are advancing simultaneously.
And in closing, I'd say we must acknowledge that this technological sophistication and expanded scope, it risks becoming an even more efficient mechanism for enforcing systemic inequality. The massive differences in lifetime interest costs, that $59,000 credit tax, and the migration of scoring into crucial non-financial aspects of life, that demonstrates how this system deepens structural economic divisions, making essential societal participation conditional on a financial heuristic.
This discussion really highlights a fundamental trade-off: systems striving for greater predictive accuracy and wider inclusion,
versus systems that inevitably amplify inequality through generalized yet unavoidable financial judgments that compound historical disadvantage.
The sophisticated listeners, I think, left to weigh the benefits of technical accuracy against the undeniable risk that these complex and rapidly expanding scoring systems are deepening the structural divisions in our economy. There's clearly more to explore in this material.